This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and a generous investment by Julianne Wrigley.
This is the result, and many of you have seen this image. Basically, over the last 250 years at most, the whole thing explodes on us. All these curves, whether they are population or McDonald's or energy or waste or whatever, they all show the same pattern. This acceleration has come to a point over the last 250 years. What then is the dynamic behind these crises that we are getting? The crises that we are seeing all around us. And now I go back for a little bit to the theoretical part of the talk. Basically, the result of the fact that that because our minds, even collectively, are limited in the number of dimensions they can grasp at any time, it basically means that, yes, we have huge amount of progress in science and elsewhere, but because the world outside that is not touched by that has many more dimensions, the unintended consequences actually even rise faster than our knowledge. And ultimately, what I would argue is that our crisis currently, whether it's the financial or the economic or the social or the environmental, are all due to the fact that we are being overwhelmed by the unintended consequences of our own actions. I think that is the basis for where we are at this particular point. As part of that process, we've become more and more short-termist because we need to deal with all these problems all over the place, and that makes it much more difficult to keep thinking strategically and thinking long-term. So I would define a crisis or these crises as temporary incapacities of our society and its information processing to deal with the dynamics that it's involved in and that it has in part generated itself. So, although we think we know more and more, we actually know less and less. But I would argue the situation isn't hopeless because it makes no sense giving up. And in particular, from my perspective as an archaeologist, I can affirm that humanity has at any point in time when the crunch really got bad, found a way out. And there's several million years to prove that. So let's look at what could be done. And that directly relates back to the whole sustainability issue that we're all about. It looks like a bad situation, but we don't know how far we are from the cliff. I mean, the fiscal cliff, yes, we do know, that's only a couple of months. But the environmental cliff, we don't have a clue. We're still trying to find out. The future is clearly full of things that may change. Apart from an asteroid hitting us, we may suddenly find that something else changes, and we've seen that to some extent in the CO2 balance when the economic crisis hit. So there is a bunch of imponderables, and we cannot, and that is in keeping with the complex systems approach, predict what will happen. We can only see that there may be a number of things we don't like so much. So even if there were a huge disaster, and this is a difficult argument that I'm not trying to push, is basically that from, again, my archaeologist's perspective, it would probably mean that a lot of people go back to the land and that they leave the cities, which are in many ways the most vulnerable part of our society. Now there is a real difficulty there, and that is that most of us wouldn't know how to deal with the land. The loss of knowledge that we have undergone over the last 60 years is a huge break in trying to deal with the kind of environmental challenges that we may have to deal with. Another good argument not to despair is the fact that there are societies that have overcome such crises. And a good example is Byzantine society. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, after they split, actually tuned down its hierarchy and decentralized virtually everything. And in doing so, so far reduced the total overhead that it could culturally hang more or less together and have, a number of hundreds of years later, a new flourishing around Byzantium. So now let's look at what we need to do. And one of the things I want to accentuate here is that in this development towards what I call the Ponzi scheme, we have effectively also changed our philosophy about the past and the future. It's a very interesting study by René Girard, who argues that in the 16th, 17th century, if something didn't fit, people would refer to history and say it doesn't fit because in history it wasn't like that. By now, we only value innovation, we only value change. So our mindset about where we are has changed. Our mindset about our time perspective has changed. Society has become innovation dependent, I said that. But more importantly, I think, and a real issue that we need to deal with in sustainability, is that our economy and our need to drive up GDP is now such that we innovate n'importe quoi, anything. And as soon as somebody has discovered it, we stuff it down our own throats and we actually accept it. We can call this for cell phones, we can call it for a lot of things. And I'm not saying that these inventions don't have their positive side. But what I am saying is that too rapid an accumulation of inventions like that really disorganizes society, because every invention needs the society to adapt to it. And if you go too fast, you can't do that. I heard Michael Crow say a number of years ago that the real threat about nanotechnology, for example, is that people don't know anymore what's happening. You can be breathing the most foulest of things without even realizing that you're doing it. You can't even imagine what it's like. So we are basically exceeding there our own cognitive capacities. So we need to rethink innovation. And that is what I've been working on over the last 8 years. Basically saying, our classical science, because it was all reductionist, basically whenever innovation or creativity came, it put it in a box on the side, a black box on the side. We can't deal with this as scientists, so it's not important. We deal with the conditions under which it happens, and we deal with the results in our economy. But we don't study the process of innovation, and as such, we don't really know how innovation works. And that is where José and a couple of other people and myself have been working in recent years, trying to begin to see whether if you really look at the process of creation, there isn't some logic to that, that from a complex systems perspective, you could try and grasp, because that is a perspective that looks at emergence of new things, whereas our pre-existing origins perspective doesn't in any way allow that.
This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability for educational and non-commercial use only.